The Free Trade Agreement. Not by Bill Mitchell. On January 1st, 2005, the ABC carried the headline, Business Welcomes Trade Deal, which officially came into force as the new year unfolded. The Australian-US free trade deal was touted by the current government as a major breakthrough. Well, from where I sit, it is neither a free trade agreement or one that we will look favorably on in the years to come. The fact that the ALP tried to convince us that they were capable of showing leadership, not, by passing it with some irrelevant amendments, is even more frightening. The government claims the FTA will deliver more than $6 billion in benefits to the Australian economy, and the ABC reported January 1st, 2005, that the Australian Industry Group, AIG, predict the benefits will be even higher. The AIG, which represents the manufacturing sector, is reported by the ABC as saying, quote, Australia's been really out of favor and really limited in its opportunities to get access to what government buys from industry generally in the U.S., and that is $200 billion of purchases every year, end quote. The ABC also quoted the Trade Minister, Mark Vaile, as claiming, quote, this is the most significant trade agreement in Australia's history. As of today, 97% of Australia's manufactured goods going into the United States go in tariff-free. It has the potential to deliver 30,000 new jobs in the Australian economy, end quote. The U.S. Ambassador, Tom Schiffer, was quoted in similar upbeat manner as saying, quote, what Australian entrepreneurs now have as a result of the free trade agreement is free access not only to the 20 million people who live here, but to the 320 million people who live in our two countries, end quote. This is the nonsense that has been continually dished up by the proponents of the FTA. The problem is that the main areas in which we can make gains from accessing the larger U.S. market are blocked under the FTA. This is in the area of agriculture, but where the real gains will be made are in areas that the U.S. corporations dominate the world markets, and our firms hardly rank a mention. Basically, I conclude that A. The FTA is an appalling example of the Australian government and the opposition selling Australia's economic and cultural interests out in return for short-term political gains. B. The Australian business sector has been sold a rope-a-dope strategy by the government. C. In pursuit of so-called economic credibility, the so-called Party of the Workers and Unions, the ALP, has shown a lack of courage that is breathtaking. And D. The U.S. alliance is not functioning in Australia's interests if the FTA is the exemplar of our cooperation. I urge readers to venture back into the records of the Senate inquiry into the FTA, which was completed in 2004. It is hard to deduce from the evidence before that inquiry that a promised land is on our doors as a consequence of the introduction of the FTA. Indeed, the evidence exposed the FTA as a damaging agreement and definitely not in Australia's long-term interests. The type and scale of the gains from the FTA mentioned above will become swamped by the longer-term costs of the deal. The evidence clearly indicates that the negotiations were not between equals. The U.S. government trade negotiators completely overran our own interests. In the SMH article, November 22, 2004, Labor and We Will Live to Regret U.S. Trade Deal, Ross Gittins claims that, quote, the Americans drove such an unfair bargain that John Howard should have walked away from it, as it's strongly rumored his negotiators wanted him to, but he pressed on, end quote. The cheering by the AIG and the government seems to be odd given that the tariff barriers to manufacturing have already been largely eliminated over the last 20 years. The general tariff was only 5%, and many manufacturers face only a 2% tariff. Trifling indeed. Further, there is the hardly discussed but complex rules of origin test on exports, which will disadvantage Australia as a consequence of the high percentage of imported components that we have to use. Ross Giddens also notes that there are additional costs arising from trade diversion. Because of our preferential treatment of the Yanks, we'll be importing more of their stuff at the expense of stuff from our Asian trading partners, even when the Asian stuff is better or cheaper. As background, I urge readers to research the consequences of NAFTA, the agreement between USA, China, and Mexico. A good place to start is by reading the prestigious Economic Policy Institute report, March 31, 2001, NAFTA at 7, Its Impact on Workers in All Three Nations, which demonstrates that the NAFTA agreement generated job losses in the U.S. of around 766,030 jobs, and around 276,000 in Canada. The trade changes following NAFTA, increasing the U.S. trade deficit, in turn put downward pressure on the wages of poorly educated U.S. workers. Around 73% of the workforce are non-college graduates, for three reasons. A. Displaced manufacturing workers have moved to the service sector where wages average 23% less. B. The service sector labor supply has grown and is driving down wages. And C. Employers have used their new freedom to move across borders as a tool in collective bargaining by threatening to close plants. The EPI also notes that Mexican workers have also incurred substantial losses under NAFTA, despite the number of jobs increases. The so-called maquiladora plants that expanded to manufacture products formerly produced in the U.S. and Canada. But the growth in employment has seen the deterioration of workers' rights, wages, and conditions. The EPI reports that manufacturing wages have dropped by 21% and salaried workers have suffered a decline of 25% in their wages. The incomes of self-employed have dropped by 40%, and the purchasing power of the Mexican minimum wage has dropped by almost 50% over the period of NAFTA to date. In addition, the Mexican maquiladora plants have generated environmental havoc in local communities as a result of their uncontrolled toxic waste practices. You might also like to read the Human Rights Watch report, April 2001, Trading Away Rights, the Unfulfilled Promise of NAFTA's Labor Side Agreement, which convincingly argues that despite a raft of complaints from workers concerning illegal sackings for organizing or joining a union, denial of collective bargaining, poor occupational health and safety conditions and the like, not one sanction has been imposed on a Mexican employer under the agreement. Conversely, HRW find that the signatories to NAFTA have also conspired to minimize the impact of the labor provisions, a real issue which will be relevant to the Australian-US FTA, as is that these agreements give the corporate sector the right to challenge any law it believes is not within its interests, which means that democratic intention is lost. Like NAFTA, the FTA places limits on the ability of our government to make policy which we would consider to be in the public interest. If a U.S. corporation believes their interests are damaged by an act of Australian legislation, then the FTA will give them the power to seek a court settlement outside the democratic arena under the restraint of trade provisions. These provisions have been effective under NAFTA in eroding public interest legislation. This will undoubtedly impact in the future on the price of medicine, education, and health services, the intellectual property bound up in the cultural and media areas, and, significantly, in terms of environmental protections. Our traditional strengths are in agriculture. The FTA provides very little in that area, as a consequence of the lobbying power of the U.S. farming community. For example, beef producers have to wait 18 years before the U.S. restrictions on Australian imports are lifted. so the FTA effectively blocks access to the large U.S. market for our dominant primary producers. The misnomer of free trade is clearly obvious in the failure of Australia to walk away from an agreement that did not allow our farming sector to access the U.S. markets. On the other hand, the U.S. have set up the FTA in such a way that the non-traditional trading areas in which we have no strength, those relating to intellectual property, will see huge gains for America and huge losses to Australia. These will be important in areas that the U.S. companies have significant patent, trademark, and copyright protection. Ross Gittins says, quote, "Under the camouflage of free trade, the Yanks have extracted from us commitments to increase the protection our laws and courts give to the owners of American intellectual property embodied in the goods and services we import from them, and we are and always will be huge net importers of U.S. intellectual property. So there's little reciprocity. We don't export much intellectual property to the U.S. or anywhere else. In this aspect of the deal, it's all downside." End quote. Some critics argue that we will ultimately lose the highly subsidized pharmaceutical benefits scheme, PBS, which effectively supplies medicines to Australians at wholesale prices. Instead, pressure will mount for a U.S.-style privatized pharmaceutical system, which works to guarantee U.S. corporate profits through patent monopolies, which might increase the final consumer cost of drugs by 10 times. Also in danger are our tougher food safety and consumer safety rules. The FTA, like NAFTA, will drive everything down the lowest common denominator, which in these areas is the U.S. standard. For example, our ability to legislate in areas such as biotech crops and animals is endangered. U.S. corporations could challenge our quarantine regulations as being a restraint of trade. Similar challenges have been made under NAFTA by U.S. corporations, so the lowest common denominator, harmonization, is not in our interests where the U.S. laws are inferior to Australian law. But, as Ross Gittins says that, quote, "The economically corrupt U.S. Congress has allowed America's IP law to be debauched by big corporations. So much so that the Yanks have quite lost sight of the public interest justification for protecting IP. Within limits, it's in the public interest to encourage innovation by giving inventors and creators first crack at the profits to be made from that innovation." End quote. The Australian government and opposition, in seeking the amendments, seemed content to protect some current level or standards. The local TV content is an example. The FTA does not permit us to increase the local content ratio from its current level. Further, we are unable to impose local content rules on new media. This is at a time when the world is at the cusp of an optic fiber-driven media revolution. Conclusion. The FTA is very poor policy and threatens our national sovereignty. It places corporate profit above traditional issues like public health, food safety, environmental, and labor standards. It allows foreign corporations to challenge and hence dictate Australian legislation designed to protect our public interest. The balance between non-economic interests and the profits of large corporations has been lost in the FTA. Ross Gittins says, quote, "The further we get into the future on local content and many other things, the more we'll realize how much of our sovereignty we've given up and how much we're being pushed around by greedy U.S. corporations." End quote. That is enough for today.